Round 10 of the Formula 1 World Championship saw the sport head to Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix, and with it, a familiar story. Max Verstappen takes an early lead, controls the vast majority of the Grand Prix, then has to hold off a resurgent Lando Norris before taking the victory. Ah yes, we've seen it before, no doubt we'll see it again. But here is the result for you. As I say, Max Verstappen took the victory, finishing just over 2 seconds ahead of Lando Norris, who looked very, very strong out there. Third and fourth, it was the two Mercedes. That's right, Lewis Hamilton led George Russell home ahead of the two Ferraris in 5th and 6th. Leclerc ahead of his teammate Sainz. Piastri came home 7th. Sergio Perez, yes, in 8th, a great result for him. And Gasly and Ocon, the two Alpines, getting in the points. A great result for Alpine, taking home 3 for the constructors. Then it was the Haas of Hulkenberg, the Aston Martin for Fernando Alonso, not a great result for the Spaniard. Zhou Guanyu, Lance Stroll, Ricardo Bottas, Magnussen, Albon, Tsunoda and Logan Sargent making up the last place. Well, that's how it stands, but joining me to discuss every element of the Grand Prix, I'm delighted to have Jake Boxall-Legge, aka JBL, and there it is, home Grand Prix, sort of. It's the Belgian Phil Cleeren. Gents, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thank you. I think, expectations were always sort of iffy when it comes to the Spanish Grand Prix. I didn't think it was the worst Spanish Grand Prix we've ever had, which we'll get into in a bit. But yeah, sort of teased a sort of slightly more interesting result than one we got. But otherwise, tactically, it was sort of quite entertaining.
Yeah, as JBL said, I thought it was quite interesting strategically, but then, it never really felt like Max was going to lose once he was in the lead. So not the thriller that maybe we wanted to see and that we've been accustomed to see over the past 3 or 4 races.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how many times the commentators yelled as loudly as they could in a high-pitched voice that Norris was catching Verstappen, you did feel that maybe he could turn the screw when he needed to. But thoughts really, where do we start on this one? Where do we start with the Spanish Grand Prix? Let's start with the positives, right? Let's start with that battle between Verstappen and Lando Norris. Now, I've read what Norris has said. He seems to be disappointed. Now, that's a big swing, isn't it, from what we saw last year from Lando Norris? But he's disappointed at only finishing 2nd place.
Yeah, definitely. I think the McLaren has made a certain amount of steps now where the team can genuinely say, look, we should be winning races now. I think the part they're missing out on is know-how. Obviously, yes, of course, they have won a race this season, but it's the difference between getting one race result and delivering week after week, and that's something that Red Bull does, and that's something that McLaren hasn't done for well over a decade. So that's something that it needs to recover and recoup and understand. When we were looking at the race, I think you can sort of, obviously it was a 2-stopper, generally speaking, 2 sort of different ways of skinning that cat. Either you go soft, medium, soft, or soft, medium, hard. Verstappen and Norris both went for the soft, medium, soft strategy. So they were sort of pretty much there at neck and neck. McLaren had built that offset. But you can look at where the race was lost for Norris at the start, which is where Verstappen says he won it, and the final stint when Norris was closing in. It just wasn't happening at the rate of knots enough. And I think, I make notes lap after lap of the gap between the front two. And I think it got to a point about, lap 53 where I saw the gap had only come down by, like about 0.3, which is a decent chunk, but I'd written down it's not going to happen. Verstappen's won it. And it didn't come down much further than that. It came down to another 3 seconds, but that's not enough.
Yeah, what was it? At certain points, it was coming down by 0.5, 0.6 of a second, then it started to plateau a bit, didn't it? Well, Phil, you're out there. You've been able to see the drivers, talk to the drivers, presumably hear what they've had to say. What has Lando Norris's demeanour been like? Because we are seeing a different Lando Norris.
Yeah, we're seeing a Lando Norris that is now shifted his expectations. He's no longer happy with 3rd, as he said in the race. Like, are we going for 1st or for 3rd? And he's very much now thinking about, how do I win this race? Because he's got the car to do so. And, well, we know Lando as a bit of a glass half empty kind of person. So he's always going to be very self-critical and critical of the team and what could have been. But yeah, his perspective has shifted into, I want to fight for wins every single weekend, because now McLaren has given me the car that I can do it with. So if something happens like the start, which he feels he made a mistake, then he's going to be slating himself for that. That's sort of his mentality, his nature. We've seen that in the past as well. So, yeah, he's got a winning mentality, as you should have. So he will be disappointed with second now. That is now his new reality.
One victory, 4 second places and the 4th place in the last 6 Grand Prix for Lando Norris. For McLaren, it's been a brilliant upturn of form, hasn't it? What has Max Verstappen said then about the race? He seemed to be pretty happy. I mean, he's on top of the podium, he's winning, and I think he acknowledged they didn't have the quickest car, JBL.
Yeah, I think, and he's not the only driver that said that. Carlos Sainz has also said that the McLaren's the quickest car. Norris said that we were the fastest today. So that's kind of where the wind seems to have changed towards. But the thing is, when you look at McLaren, obviously the McLaren-Lando Norris combination is incredibly strong, but it's not as compelling at this moment compared to Red Bull and Max Verstappen, which is a pairing that has won so much over the last few seasons. So they know how to do it. They know how to go and get that result, even if they don't have the fastest car. And it's something that they've been doing for a long time now. I think, yeah, again, going back to the start, getting ahead of Norris was very, very important. So you had the 2 cars going down into turn 1 side by side. Verstappen touches the grass a little bit, and so there's a little bit of loss of momentum there, but ultimately still threads the needle. That was key point number 1. And the second one, he says, was making sure that he didn't take too long to pass George Russell. And so, obviously the early laps are kind of dictated a little bit by tyre saving and that kind of thing. Degradation was really, really high around the Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya. So it was a difficult one to manage, and you've got to get that quite right. And that's why he couldn't take too long, because, the longer it's drawn out, the more difficult it's going to be, because he's facing a load of dirty air, tyres are overheating. So throw caution to wind a little bit, get a good exit out, turn 13, 14, and just, stick the DRS on. Staying within DRS range was crucial, and got the job done. So that was the other one. Then from there, with clean air, time management, that's, the world's your oyster, really. So for Verstappen, that's why it was a lot easier than the job Norris had to do.
What about George Russell there? You just sort of touched on his first corner overtake. That was a very impressive move, wasn't it, Phil? And George then had that battle with Lando Norris a little bit later on.
Yeah, it was very impressive. It's not something we saw coming, because I think everybody, at least I was, focused on Max versus Lando. Lando pushing Max towards the grass a little bit. And then, Russell had a mega run off the 2 and swooped past. So that was quite exciting. I spoke to George afterwards. He said that was the start I dreamed of. But then, I think you saw later on that he just didn't really have the pace to keep either of them at bay, really. It shows that Mercedes are close. They are not at the level of Red Bull or McLaren, but they do seem to have confirmed on a couple of different circuits now that their recent upgrades have delivered. So that is encouraging to see. It's now very close between them and Ferrari, and depending on the circuit, maybe it'll swing a little bit more. Maybe they'll both move towards Red Bull and McLaren as well. But really cool start from Russell. That was nice. Very combative. Is it the smart thing to do to take out a lot out of your tyres and battle a quicker car in Norris? Maybe not, but we want to see a motor race, and that was nice to see.
Was it 2, 3, 4, 5 corners, something like that, wasn't it, JBL, that we saw Russell and Norris going at it, and that was fantastic racing because it was good, honest racing. It was racing that wasn't dirty. It was just 2 drivers really going at it, and it was a real pleasure to watch.
Yeah, it's just 2 drivers that really respect each other, 2 drivers that have raced each other for a very, very long time. I remember back in my days as Formula 2's press officer, having to watch them do battle there. So so it was a good ding dong between them. Obviously Norris won out just by, I think, boxing a little bit clever, really, in turn 5, just knowing that Russell was going to steam up down the inside. So going for the cutback option, knowing that he was going to get the traction into turn 6 and 7, playing the patient game. It was always going to happen eventually because the McLaren driver just had that little bit more pace. But, watching 2 drivers race each other rather than go, we're just going to do our race and back out of it, which we see too much in contemporary Formula 1 because it's not in the data plan. It was just refreshing.
And for Mercedes, it's nice to see them actually fighting for things, isn't it? Because look at Lewis Hamilton. There was a moment near the end of the Grand Prix where Lewis was on softs. I think that George was on hards at that point there. It was a different strategy. And Lewis was questioning whether he should be given that place because I think he felt he had the pace. And then he had to almost overtake George under his own steam, didn't he? That George wasn't going to give him the place, so Lewis had to go and get it. Now, Phil, being there in Barcelona and seeing that happen and the response of the drivers and the fans around, I'm sure it was greeted with a big cheer as well, because there's still a lot of love for Lewis Hamilton in Formula One. Do you think that, and it was probably a really simple question, a yes, one answer thing, but would Lewis Hamilton have taken a huge amount of pleasure from that he beat his teammate? He's going to be leaving, obviously, Lewis going off to Ferrari and getting his first podium of the season.
Well, I won't just leave you hanging with a simple yes, Bryn, but that is pretty much it. I mean, a lot has been made about, is Lewis going to be treated fairly? Obviously had this really bizarre email chain and people suspecting foul play, but there's, as Toto Wolff says, I'm not saying you need to trust everything a team boss says all the time, but there is no reason for Mercedes to leave points on the table when they're fighting with 3 other teams for every single point. So yes, they are desperate to finish on a high with Lewis. Definitely a lot of fans, a lot of cheers whenever he was introduced, whenever he made a move as well. He does deserve a good send-off with Mercedes for the 12 years that he's been there, and know that Mercedes has a car that can possibly win a race later this year. It might be, it might be a good fitting ending to that story rather than sort of fizzling out.
Given that he was on different tyres to George, though, JBL, do you think that it was a wiser move maybe for George just to let him through?
I think yes and no. Obviously, from the team perspective of trying to make sure that Lewis doesn't lose too much time, then yes, obviously. But they were on 2 different strategies and they were trying to make one work over the other. And so you don't really want to give George the situation where he's got obviously what turns out to be the worst strategy, and have to, add insult to injury and let Hamilton by as well. I think, there was still room for the hard tyre to sort of come on song, and perhaps the softs would wear off a little bit. But either way, the move was done. It was done relatively cleanly. So, to be honest, I'd rather let them sort of race themselves and sort it out on track.
Tyre strategy then, are we saying, I think Max Verstappen said as he was doing his radio message to his team that they weren't the quickest car, but they got the strategy calls correct. Now, are we saying that obviously there was one strategy that was better than the others? This split strategy, JBL, how does it work in principle? How does it work out in principle? Are we saying that maybe Mercedes and Ferrari got it spot on, got it wrong by mixing the strategy the way they did?
I think, as Phil's kind of already said, the soft, medium, soft was clearly the way to go. And it was all a legacy. Again, as Phil said, it's what you did in that first stint. And you can kind of see that with the 2 Ferraris, actually. Both drivers were told to save tyres a little bit. Sainz did, arguably the worst job of the 2 doing that and didn't save tyres for a couple of laps at all. So that gravitated him towards a much shorter soft stint. And so you're either compensating in your medium stint or you've got to take a hard at the end. And the tyre sort of delta, because we had the 3 hardest compounds this weekend, and the tyre delta was, pretty high. You were going to get a lot of time out of the soft tyres, but again, drop-off was quite high. So it sort of depends where your strategy is, basically, and if you can extend that soft stint, and that's basically, what you saw all the front runners doing as well. So what you saw Max doing, that's what you saw Lando doing to a kind of greater extreme. And so that gives you the best possible chance later in the race when the fuel's burned off. It's a little bit easier to manage those mediums longer into the race, and then it's a little bit easier to manage the soft tyres at the end, which is what you saw Norris continuing to push and Max being able to respond to that. So yeah, again, it sort of depends what the drivers do. Obviously, if you've got an opportunity where it's not clear cut and you are going to split, then it's a good thing to do, but one driver's always going to be worse off. So you're kind of hedging your bets a little bit. I mean, that's the wonderful world of F1 strategy, isn't it? You're not entirely sure what's going to happen until it does, and one driver will always be unhappy.
Strategist saying do this and the driver doesn't do that, and then the strategy has to be changed and the driver then unhappy because the strategy's changed. It's that whole kind of chicken and egg situation, I suppose. But talk about Carlos Sainz for a second then, because he had that overtake from his teammate Leclerc into turn one. They did touch, he ran wide, he then passed off track in theory. So what's the general thought there? Because I watched that and thought, well, he was on the outside of turn one, there was contact, and he passed essentially off track. Should he have given the place back? Are you happy with that? What's the thought process going on there, Phil?
I don't really have a strong opinion on it. It's mainly, the thing is, if you get touched, then you feel like you were forced to go off track. So it's not like you did because you wanted to. So it's a tough one to judge. Clearly, Sainz didn't give Leclerc a whole lot of space. Not to say not enough space, and Charles was very unhappy about it. And he said, like, maybe Carlos is trying to be the hometown hero and is being a bit more aggressive, trying to get a good result here. And there probably is some of that, because he's also fighting for his career still in a way, although I think he probably has a good idea what he's going to do. But it's this dynamic, isn't it, of Ferrari fighting each other a little bit harder than maybe they were doing in the past. Carlos and Charles get on really well off the track, but I feel like on the track is getting ever more feisty between the two.
Yeah, and Charles did end up with front wing damage as a result of it, only a little bit, but there was that touch with Sainz's rear right tyre. Sainz said that he was entitled to space because he was ahead at the corner, and it's like, yeah, that's true, but if you could say the same if you'd outbraked yourself and just steaming into the corner, you're never going to make it, but you could say you were ahead. But the reason why Sainz didn't, get told to give the position back was, I think there was a directive over the race weekend. I think it's been the same over the last few races as at Barcelona as well. They've got that track, the runoff sort of around the bollard. And I think they basically developed that to create a similar time delta, if not make it a little bit slower. And Sainz did go around that and preserve the position. I don't think Ferrari were going to fight that too hard because, you got two drivers on different strategies. They're not going to go switch it around because at that moment in time, Sainz was maybe a little bit quicker. But then that was also the point, which I spoke about earlier, where Sainz was taking a little bit too much out of the tyres. And so basically sort of gave himself the worst strategy. So it sort of came back to bite him eventually.
Small gains when there's a long-term game plan going on. Just quickly on Carlos Sainz though as well, because he's still this cork in the bottle of where's he going to go. He's going to release certain other drivers around, and we're going to know a lot more when this part of the puzzle falls into place. It's getting a bit dull waiting for this announcement of where is Carlos Sainz going to go. I mean, where is he going to go? When are we going to find out? And when can we all move on with our lives, JBL?
I think it's. He spoke about this in the press conference. Actually, he said that he intends to make a decision very soon because he doesn't want to wait forever. And I think there's a few drivers, let's say, behind him in the pecking order, saying, "Jesus Christ, Carlos! Like, come on, make a choice," because that affects their livelihoods as well. So I think in the next few weeks, next few races, maybe. We might hear something. I don't know when that's going to be. Phil might have a little bit more information here, but that seems to be what the general noise is anyway.
Yeah, I would expect a lot of movement before Silverstone, so before this triple header is over. Because as JBL said, there are a lot of drivers sort of the next dominoes in line. Not quite as JBL said, like, come on, get it over with. But speaking to Valtteri earlier, that was pretty much the gist of what he was saying. These guys all get the same questions every week, and the answer is kind of, we'll have to wait until Carlos signs for Williams or he signs for Audi.
But it's Carlos Sainz that can make the decision. So when Carlos Sainz is saying, I hope that we're able to make the decision soon, like, you're the one. You're the one that's making the decision. So it's make the decision and just get on with it.
I think there's a lot of commercial things to tie up. I'm sure it's not just all about money, but that's certainly a consideration. It's not just a short-term decision either. It's not just looking at 2025 and seeing what's competitive. It's also making a judgment call about 2026. Is Audi where it wants to be with its engine project? Williams as a customer team of Mercedes, is that going to be in a good position? And is James Vowles making the right moves that are going to attract someone of Sainz's caliber? Or is the Audi project looking, good and they're quietly confident? These are all of the things in Sainz's consideration. And he said he's not had much time of late to think about it. So hopefully he's been able to have that sit down, put pen to paper on something, and then we can hear about something soon, and then we get to work out where the other dominoes are falling.
Hey, what better time to have time to sit down and clarity when it's a triple header? It makes perfect sense to me. Absolute sense. Oh, no, it doesn't. Sorry. Absolute sarcasm just there. But it is frustrating. Carlos can make up his mind at some stage. Hopefully the pieces will fall into place soon so we can all move on with it and stop this broken record from spinning. One broken record then that has clearly ended, and that is Alpine. They have certainly turned a corner. They've had points finishes in the last 3 Grand Prix. The last 2 Grand Prix, they finished 9th and 10th. It seems like they are now moving themselves into 5th place in the 5th best team on the grid. Is that what's happening? Is it an anomaly? What's happened to Aston Martin? What's the capital of Peru? So many questions to get through. Phil, start with the latter, work backwards.
Honestly, it's almost, I don't want to discredit Alpine because they've obviously executed the weekend well with both drivers, no drama, at least not on track. Some questionable allowances that they made this week that we may or may not get into, but they had a good weekend on the track. All credit to them. However, it does feel like they benefited massively from other teams not getting their act together rather than them doing something special. Alpine do not have upgrades, and they won't have any upgrades anytime soon. Definitely not this triple header. Maybe by Spa they'll have something. But they are not really improving all that much. But definitely Aston Martin just not at the races. And then especially RB, who are actually challenging Aston Martin and even overtaking them in the pecking order. They have had a nightmare weekend that they are still trying to get to the bottom of why they just weren't competitive with their new upgrades. So I think it's more of a case of it being a relative game and seeing Aston and RB both shuffle backwards rather than Alpine doing something extraordinary with their cars.
But with that in mind then, JBL, Aston Martin stagnating, other teams making improvements, which means that Aston Martin are going backwards, and Fernando Alonso at his home Grand Prix lapped. Doesn't look good for Aston Martin.
No, it doesn't. And stagnated is absolutely the right word there because performance has regressed and they have had updates, not massive ones, but they have had them. And it just seems to be a perennial struggle to get them to unlock them. And I'm not entirely sure. It seems to be this sort of antithesis of McLaren, really, in recent years. Probably, certainly last year they built the better sort of out of the box car, but then upgrades sort of came in. It took a really long time to sort of actually get anything out of them. And they had that sort of weird phase in Mexico and Austin where they were doing very, very sort of public. That was almost writing off 2 entire race weekends to kind of test some bits. So there just seems to be this lag between putting something on the car and getting it sort of dialed in and ready for the next thing, because by the time they've got something dialed in, that's the time the next upgrade's coming, and they've only just got to the bottom of the previous one. So there needs to be some kind of fix in place for kind of that discrepancy. And yeah, again, Spain was sort of the point last year where things kind of fell off a little bit for Aston Martin, and it's just really not been at the races at all today. And just to sort of circle back to Alpine, I think it's probably surprised the team as well how well they've done, because Bruno Famin was talking on Friday that he did not expect the team to be in the hunt for points at all. So to come away with 3 in a race that had no retirements or attrition or anything like that, that's a pretty good return for a team that wasn't expecting it. So I think there's just a few teams that have put upgrades on the car and just haven't really understood how to get the best out of them, basically.
Yeah, and with Aston Martin, it doesn't completely come out of the blue either, because you also have to put it into context of the circuits that we've been to. So Aston Martin are particularly struggling to keep their car balanced through sort of the longer flowing corners, which obviously Barcelona has quite a few of. But then, for example, Canada didn't have any. So that was a circuit that suited Aston Martin really well, and that's where they got double points. So it is sort of this run of circuits that's coming up that is not going to be that kind to them, possibly. So they are really up against it in terms of trying to bring those high downforce, sort of, those fixes for particular weekends that they have at the moment. But it is starting to become a little bit alarming. I mean, yesterday, Fernando Alonso said, well, this is actually better than we expected. So he said that with a wry smile. But then today, as you say, Bryn, when getting lapped at his own race, he sort of, the mask sort of fell off, and he said, like, it's time for less talk and more action. He's starting to run out of patience, I feel.
But what about elsewhere? I mean, RB, okay, you mentioned RB a few moments ago, actually. Let's talk about RB for a second, because ignoring this Grand Prix, ignoring Spain, they've scored in the last 4 Grand Prix. Tsunoda 3 times, and Ricciardo scored once out of those 4 scoring positions there. So, is it unfair to say that RB are having a bit of a wobble again, or is it just it's a season-long wobble with a couple of glimmers of hope along the way that think we've turned the corner, and then bang, they go backwards again? What's happening, JBL?
It's funny because in pre-season testing we were calling it clearly the 6th best car, and I think it probably still is, to be honest. That's where the team is in the championship. Tsunoda has been very much the sort of best. Well, he's in, I think by my count, still in the top 10 in the points. So clearly the sort of best of the rest, let's say. But there just seems to be this big disconnect with this circuit, with the upgrades that they've put on the car. This is the first sort of real, let's say, long radius, high speed corner circuit that we've been to, and RB. Let's just say we've not seen whether it's a strength or not of theirs. They've been sort of very, very good in low speed. We know that that's where their strength is. I think last season we were all sort of saying in the paddock that with a floor upgrade that they brought to Abu Dhabi, they were best in slow speed corners overall. I think that might have been a bit of hyperbole, but clearly that's a strength. And a long radius corner requires something very, very different. It's not just a sort of about peak downforce, an absolute snap. It's how you build that downforce. And maybe it's just the car just isn't able to quite do it in the same way as perhaps the Red Bull is or anything like that. You can't make a car that works in every condition. If you could, you'd be winning every single race. So, yeah, I think that's basically where they are. Maybe Barcelona wasn't a strength for them. I think maybe with those upgrades as well, it just hasn't quite worked out. They haven't quite dialed them in, doesn't have the data on them, let's say. But it's one step back for 2 forward, let's say. And I think they should be a lot stronger as the season goes on, certainly, because again, last year their hit rate was actually pretty impressive. So it might just be a blip.
Fair enough. We'll have to see what happens next time out at Austria, which you presume would be a good circuit for Red Bull. It always seems to be when Max is involved. So what about then 2 other stories that just came about, really? One is the motorhome fire. Phil, you're out there. The motorhome hub fire for McLaren. That hit the headlines, and it was some very, very big words used, a lot of descriptive words that maybe oversold it somewhat. But, I mean, tell us what the feeling was like around there and the impact it had on McLaren. Seems to be a lot of teams rallying around them, which was nice to see.
Yeah, some of us were actually in there when it happened, because McLaren held this little media breakfast thing on Saturday morning. And right towards the end, so just before midday, the lights went out and we were kindly but very firmly asked to vacate the premises. And then as we left the building, we saw smoke pouring out from the back, where sort of the kitchen is. Turned out to be quite severe, because they couldn't immediately locate where the fire was, so it was very hard to put out. It looks like it was in between 2 floors, so it was a bit hard to get to as well. Thankfully, everybody seems to be okay. A few people were treated for smoke inhalation. They all seem to be fine, thankfully. Yeah, it was quite scary. And it is an issue. I mean, especially with the triple header now, it's quite a logistical nightmare for them. It looks like they'll be able to use it again in the future, but not straight away, because it will go back for repairs.
Yeah, I read that they're hoping to bring it back for your second home Grand Prix, the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. 2 more. Spanish Grand Prix are going to be held in Barcelona. It's the first one since it was announced it's going to move to Madrid. Just where do you feel Barcelona sits in the calendar? How fond are you of it in the moments over the years? Where do you rate it?
How do I put this charitably? It is an F1 circuit, and we are lucky to get to go to F1 circuits in our line of work. Obviously, it's a huge honour to be doing this job. But it's just become a little bit dated, unfortunately. I think facilities-wise, certainly. And I think that extends to fans and to people who work there as well. And I think ultimately it sort of needed a little bit of a refurb a while ago. That's not really ever happened. And that we've got somewhere in Madrid that... it's not quite purpose built, but it's going to be sort of like relatively sort of street adjacent circuit with what one would expect would be sort of relatively decent sort of mod cons and that kind of thing. I think if Barcelona had sort of really wanted to keep the circuit on the Formula One calendar, it might have invested in facilities a little bit and it's sort of had a weird history as well of just chopping and changing the layout, having that horrible little chicane at the end of the circuit. That was really good for pre-season testing because it sort of told us a little bit about low-speed performance, but that was about it. The fact that they took it into race weekends was just horribly fiddly, changing turn 10 on a whim every couple of years. It's a circuit that's not really ever known its place in Formula One as anything other than that's a test circuit we go to, and we use it now as a sort of a yardstick to measure how far we've come in 3 or 4 months. It's not a particularly good racing circuit. It's decent for bikes because of the sort of corner radiuses and that kind of thing. But it's not it's not what I would say is a sort of classic F1 circuit. And yeah, there'll be people who miss it. And there are a couple of corners on there that are pretty cool. Like, Camps is pretty cool, 10-3 is pretty cool, but that's about it.
It's a very frustrating circuit in a way because it's got a good enough circuit, but it hasn't updated its facilities enough. And the frustrating thing is that actually now they are starting to get things together. I think this was probably the best edition I've been to in the past 10 years. Facility-wise, transportation, logistics, traffic coming into the race was a lot better than it was last year. There was a plan agreed 2 years ago for around 50 million of investment. The frustrating thing is that things only started happening after or during the Madrid talks. So Madrid was announced, and now suddenly Barcelona is starting to really improve and get his act together. But there is a feeling that it's a bit too little too late. Will Barcelona be able to rotate with one of the other existing races? Maybe, but it is frustrating because this has been a good event this weekend, and we're going to have 2 more, and that might be it.
Feels a bit like a jilted lover, doesn't it? Promise I will change. I'll start making the bed. I'll do the washing. Please don't leave me. And it's all a little bit too late. It's a shame, though, because, there's been some good races. I thought today was actually not a bad one, but I'll leave this with you two gents then. If you could rate it out of 10, however you want to rate it, just give me a number and explain why. Your scores out of 10 for the Grand Prix we witnessed today, JBL?
I'll give it a 5, I think. It was pretty... It felt very 5-y, didn't it? Very sort of middle of the road. Wasn't the worst race we've had this season by any stretch, but not the best either.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with JBL. A 5 seems about right, which seems like a bit of a cop-out, but it was interesting enough from a strategical point of view for those who are into that sort of thing, like poor old JBL and me. If you were a fan of drama at the end and surprise winners, then clearly Max winning isn't going to tickle that. So I understand if people give it a 2 or a 3. But to me, there was enough to pay attention to find some enjoyment.
5 out of 10. Watch the highlights. There you go. Don't sit and watch the entire race again. Watch the highlights. So there you go. That's what it was, really, wasn't it? Max Verstappen didn't start on pole. He took not an early lead. I suppose it was 3rd lap, but he fell back a bit. He took that lead on the 3rd lap, then held it all the way pretty much to the end, although Norris was pushing him. Look, gents, thank you very much indeed. Well, with that all done, here are what the championship points look like right now. Max Verstappen extends his lead at the top, 219 points. He's 69 points ahead of Lando Norris, second place for the McLaren driver. Charles Leclerc just ahead of his teammate, third and fourth, 148 to 116 points. Then Sergio Perez, the second Red Bull driver, down in fifth. Then it's Piastri, Russell, Hamilton, Alonso and Tsunoda making up the top 10. Lance Stroll with 17 points. Still to score is Zhou Guanyu, Valtteri Bottas and Logan Sargent. The constructors, well, Red Bull lead the way, 330 points, moving 60 ahead of Ferrari. McLaren are closing the gap, 237 now is what they're on. Mercedes are 151. Then it's Aston Martin, RB, Alpine, Haas, Williams, and yet to score, it's Sauber. Well, that just about does it for our review of the Spanish Grand Prix. Make sure you tune in the same time next week when we turn our attention to the Austrian Grand Prix and all the happenings over there in Spielberg. Also, make sure you check out episode 4 of the James Allen on F1 podcast, featuring exclusive interviews with Ferrari team principal Fred Vasseur and former race engineer Rob Smedley. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.